That's right. All right. I understand that there's actually quite a bit of line out there, but because we only have an hour, I'm going to go ahead and start. Um, Welcome to this great panel on the Second Amendment and the Prevention of Tyranny. This is jointly brought to you by the Duke Center for Firearms Law and the Center on Law Ethics and National Security. So as many of you know, in 2008, the Supreme Court of the United States in District of Columbia versus Heller held for the first time that the Second Amendment protects a right to own a firearm for personal purposes like self-defense in the home. Although that opinion relied heavily on the needs of individuals for firearms and protecting them from burglars and criminals, there are seeds in that opinion that speak to the original concern of the framers, which spoke often of the fear of standing armies under the control of a despot. So portions of the Heller opinion seem to embrace this latter notion of the Second Amendment, speaking of, quote, the natural right of resistance and self-preservation, and, quote, when the able-bodied men of a nation are trained in arms and organized, they are better able to resist tyranny. And of course, the anti-tyranny notion of the Second Amendment has quite a bit of purchase in the political and social realms, and is perhaps summed up in this startling phrase about the Second Amendment, that it's, quote, not about hunting ducks, it's about hunting politicians. So to get some traction on these issues, I am very happy to say that we've got a great and esteemed panel together to discuss these topics. So to my immediate right is Professor Dave Kopel. He is the research director at the Independence Institute and an associate policy analyst at the Cato Institute in Washington, and an adjunct professor of advanced constitutional law at the University of Denver's Sturm College of Law. I know Dave from his work. He's incredibly prolific. In addition to the scores of law review articles that he's written, as well as a lively litigation practice on Second Amendment issues, he's the author of 17 books, including The Samurai, the Mountie, and the Cowboy, Should America Adopt the Gun Controls of Other Democracies, which was named the Book of the Year by the American Society of Criminology. Before joining the Independence Institute, Professor Kopel served as an assistant attorney general for the state of Colorado, and he holds a JD from the University of Michigan Law School and a BA in history from Brown. To his right is Professor George Mocsary, an associate professor of law at Southern Illinois University. He, along with Dave and others, are the authors of the casebook Firearms, Law, and the Second Amendment, Regulation, Rights, and Policy, which was the first law school casebook on the topic, and it's now in its second edition. His scholarship also has been cited by the U.S. Supreme Court, as well as in other federal courts and state courts. And then to his right is our own General Charlie Dunlap. He's a professor of the practice here at Duke Law, as well as executive director of the Center for Law, Ethics, and National Security. He joined the faculty in 2010 after retiring as an Air Force Major General following 34 years of distinguished service as a military lawyer. He's a graduate of St. Joseph's University and Villanova University School of Law, and also a distinguished graduate of the National War College. He won an award for his essay, The Origins of the American Military Coup of 2012, becoming an entree in serving as an advisor on the film The Enemy Within. I didn't know this about you, Charlie.
Yeah, that essay was written in 1992, so it couldn't actually occur. So if you watch the movie, I get 1/100th of 1 cent. So.
His current interest involves
be money.
A wide variety of issues that are germane to our panel today, as is his article, The Revolt of the Masses, Armed Civilians and the Insurrectionary Theory of the Second Amendment, which appeared in the University of Tennessee Law Review. And he has told me to make sure to check out his blog, Lawfire, which I'm sure many of you have checked out. Now, I've asked these panelists for very short 3-minute remarks, and then we'll begin a moderated discussion on the topic of the prevention of tyranny and the Second Amendment with some time at the end to open up the floor to questions from you all. I'm sure you have many of them. So with no further ado, Dave, you want to start us off?
Sure. As Professor Larry Tribe wrote in American Constitutional Law, the entire U.S. Constitution is a tyranny prevention document. That is the fundamental purpose, both to prevent tyranny of a despotic government with unchecked centralized power, and to prevent the tyranny that might result, for example, from foreign conquest against a confederation of states that was too weak and divided to be able to resist a foreign tyrant. The Second Amendment is part of that anti-tyranny system, and as the founders understood it and their intellectual forebears, the whole thing is anti-tyranny. And there's, yes, King George could be a tyrant, for example. A tyrant is someone who illegitimately exercises power for his own benefit over someone else, rather than being a proper ruler who governs for the benefit of the governed. But tyranny can also be at a micro level. A boss or a bishop or lots of other people can be tyrants to people over whom they illegitimately exercise power. Slavery, obviously, is subjecting someone to a form of tyranny. And likewise, in the founders' understanding, a criminal government is just a larger scale thing than an individual criminal. If you are attacked by 4 highwaymen on the road and raped and robbed, that is tyranny in just the same sense as if the standing army comes to pillage your town and do the same thing. It's only a difference of scale. The differences of scale have practical implications in that the individual can resist the home invader in the classic Heller's scenario, what the case was mainly about. You can't really and shouldn't do that as an individual. Resistance to governmental tyranny needs to be on a more collective scale and in a different, and has lots of prudential concerns about it. But it's all one and the same thing. There's not tyranny resistance over here and keeping the burglar out of your house over there. They're all on a single continuum. And the founders believed that the historical record strongly showed that when the government has a monopoly of force, it doesn't always lead to tyranny, but tyranny is inevitably accompanied by a monopoly of force and disarmament of the victims.
So I have much to say. I guess I have many of the same views, and I'll add just a few things onto that. I think that the Second Amendment in particular was concerned with 4 types of potential tyranny. One, federal on state tyranny, federal on individual tyranny. That's 2 actually, state on individual, and then this individual on individual tyranny. And they also, they did see a popular militia as protection from foreign enemies, but the founders saw a much smaller distinction, as Dave said, between self-defense against crime and other individuals and self-defense against an overbearing government than we might see today. The notion that somehow we can't, the American notion, I should say, that somehow the government is supreme and we should submit was something that Robert Churchill describes it fairly well, developed after the Civil War and really went through the end of the Cold War and now is starting to wane and perhaps fall apart a little bit. I think the notion that it can't happen here is historically defective. I'm biased because my family lived under tyranny, lived under communism. My father was a political prisoner for 16 years for helping student leaders speak. So if you wanted to go out and demonstrate in one of the quads here at school and you were saying something against the government where my parents grew up, you might be arrested. And so my father was someone who was trying to help people who were doing that and help them escape from the Iron Curtain and so on, and he was found out and jailed. My mother had to flee from behind the Iron Curtain in the middle of the night over a minefield after she got a special permit even to be near the border between Hungary and Austria. They both had property confiscated and so on. And so I came to realize at some point there are some things that it's a lot harder to do to an armed population. So as you know, as Dave said, an armed population is not a guarantee of protection from an overbearing government, just like being armed is not a guarantee of protection from a would-be individual attacker, but being a disarmed population is a prerequisite for tyranny, for ongoing tyranny. I think all 10 of the justices who decided Heller and MacDonald recognized the tyranny control purpose of the Second Amendment. And I would add, I think it's important to recognize that there are two places to look for this purpose. One is what happened at the founding, the so-called founding fathers, and the other is what happened when the 14th Amendment was adopted, and the Reconstruction Amendments, the Civil Rights Acts, and the Freedmen's Bureau Acts, and so on, around the time of the 14th Amendment. And if you look at both of those, you can really see the dichotomy, you can see the two aspects overlapping. At the founding, the great concern was this large-scale tyranny from the federal government. The founders didn't really foresee state tyranny of the kind that happened after the Civil War. The founding sons, those who wrote anyway, the 14th Amendment, were really concerned about the latter. They were concerned about the second kind. They constantly spoke of state militias and armed mobs attacking the freed slaves who were disarmed by the Black Codes and similar laws. And I think a picture of those two things really gives a sense of what tyranny can look like even here.
I take a little different view than my learned colleagues.
Learned, can you imagine?
Yeah, but if you've been to English court, when they start calling each other learned colleagues, it's not always a compliment.
I'm writing that down, by the way.
No, actually, I do take a different perspective. And in my original article that I wrote for the Tennessee Law Review, I had a different assessment of what the Supreme Court eventually found and the origins of the Second Amendment and what its purpose was. I reread it recently, and I'd forgotten how brilliant I really was, because I was right and the Supreme Court is wrong. I think that the Second Amendment very much was aimed at furnishing people for the militia. It was related to the militia. And it wasn't just the whole concept, the military concept that the founders had. It wasn't just about, opposing tyranny. I see the Constitution, by the way, as not an anti-anything, but a pro-life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness document and a pro-democracy document. The concept had much to do with they didn't want to pay for a standing army. Because you might remember one of the causes of the revolution was the Stamp Act. What was the Stamp Act for? To pay for the British Army and the French and Indian War and so forth. So it had a lot to do with economics. The other thing is that we just heard about how the Iron Curtain fell and how the oppressed nations of communism became free, at least in eastern part of Europe. That was not only a population that had no guns, that was a population that was held down by pervasive and extremely powerful internal security services. So the idea that you have to have an armed populace in order to resist tyranny, I think, is a false one. So, and I'm sure we're going to get into more of the detail, but I would just suggest that the idea that the standing army of today, it is not in the culture of the armed force even to think about not obeying the Constitution. It's not, and in militaries, culture matters a lot. And there was only one instance where the U.S. military ever thought about a coup, and that was in 1783 at Newburgh, when the Continental soldiers had been unpaid for years. There was a bunch of officers got together, and they were going to march on Washington until George Washington spoke to them. And he so emotionally affected them. There was an article not too long ago in the New York Times where a historian pointed out, ever since that, and they became so embarrassed that they even thought about a coup, it crushed the concept in the U.S. military ever since. And recently, there's an article, as I mentioned, in the New York Times, where Sturry made that point, that his tear-jerking speech so changed things that we've never really had that even thought about. And let me tell you, you served 35 years in the military as I did, you go through a lot of different administrations. And people are, oh, it must have been better with this party or that party. It doesn't work that way. You're just responsive to whatever our democracy puts in front of you in terms of your leadership. And I really disagree with those who suggest otherwise, and that force is suspect in terms of its loyalty and adherence to the Constitution. Remember what happened when we had to desegregate schools. Well, you won't remember, because George and I remember in the 1950s. They sent troops, airborne troops. Guess where most of those airborne troops were from? The Deep South. Yet they were the ones, when the police won't do anything, they're the ones who stood up against tyranny. So I just have a different perspective.
So you spoke a little bit already about like the sort of framers' conception. We talked about Newburgh, as you say, the one opportunity there was, or one was for a military coup, and it's come up about the Civil War and Reconstruction, and as Dave has said, we can sort of think of it sort of the anti-tyranny perspective along a continuum, but I don't know if that continuum necessarily answers sort of concrete cases, which is sort of a hard issue after Heller, which is now it's an enforceable right. So in that sort of mix, how do you sort of think of the phenomena of, for example, the Civil War itself? So the Civil War is very much the southern states in support of slavery, claiming that they are taking up a natural right to resist a tyrannical government, that tyrannical government being the Lincoln's administration, and expressly take on the sort of rhetoric and sort of natural law goals of the Declaration of Independence in support of secession and rebellion. So when you think about the sort of anti-tyranny rationale, how, if any way, does that phenomena play into your sort of thinking? Anybody on the panel?
Many of the Confederates were, as Professor Miller said, sincere in feeling that, and of course many people in the Union were equally sincere in thinking the other way. I think I would agree that, as I would say, the Union was right, but you can't convince somebody of that when you're in the moment necessarily. And that is what was John Locke and Patrick Henry called it. It's left to the appeal to heaven. He doesn't. That God at least sometimes grants victory to the righteous and the just, and that's ultimately why one of the reasons the Confederacy finally collapsed was if they'd wanted to carry on a guerrilla war and keep on going for a long time, they absolutely had the capacity to do so. But partly Southern morale collapsed because their series of military reverses was to the Southern population an indication that God was actually, in fact, not on their side. But the answer is there's no way to answer that, because some people think they're insurrectionists, and other people say they're restoring constitutional order. And the beliefs may be equally sincere on both sides, which is why the prudential concerns about don't just go off and lead a rebellion, because you had a bad day and the voices in your head are telling you to do it. The preference under the American and Western civilization system is that something would be at least led by intermediate magistrates, local governors, state governments in the American system. Obviously, the Civil War was as well, so it met that test, but they still turned out to be incorrect.
George? So it's an interesting question, and I think there are two questions there, really. One is whether it was okay for the North, for the Union, to stop the secession of the Confederacy, and one, whether it was okay to go to war to stop slavery, which was, a blight on our history, right? A blatant human rights violation, and no one disagrees on that, right? I think the answer to the first is a lot more difficult. I think there's a fairly strong case to be made that the Union was wrong in keeping the southern states from seceding, right? The individual states withdrew from the Articles of Confederation as well. That was supposed to be a perpetual union, according to one of its terms. The notion of secession is inherent in the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution doesn't forbid it. And the Constitution is supposed to be a document that leaves all unenumerated powers to the states. The Supreme Court held otherwise in Texas versus White, said secession is okay. I happen to know
Not okay, right.
What's that?
Texas v. White said secession's not okay.
What did I say? The opposite?
Yeah. You left out the.
Terrible faux pas.
You
right?
left out the.
Yes, it said it's not okay. No, what did I say? It's not okay. Yes.
Yeah.
You're all confusing me now.
Yeah.
Stop it.
Yes, my learned colleague.
Yeah, the learned colleague. That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's 1 point for Charlie. That's a different question from going to war for the just cause, right? From the just war of ending slavery. That, in my mind, is an easy question. And a Southern claim or a Confederate claim, I should say, that somehow the North was infringing on its right to have slaves is just abjectly nonsense. And I say that despite the point made earlier in class today, the good point that, look, some of the founders owned slaves, and yes, they were blatant hypocrites in doing that. So I think those are two separate questions, and I think they can be answered separately with different answers.
Well, I have two quick observations. Number one, I disagree with my other learned colleague that the South had the capacity to wage a guerrilla war. If you look at, Lee actually had that discussion at Appomattox, and he pointed out that he only had 18,000 muskets in reserve, and didn't have the capacity to wage war, because we forget how insurgencies are conducted, and the South was laid waste at that point. There was no supply chain. They are already stripping the mountains of everything that lived, practically. If you came across a squirrel, you were a lucky person. So I don't think that there was that capacity. And if you look at why Congress restored Lee's citizenship in 1973, it talks a lot about that. The second thing is, people say. Second thing is, people say wars never settle anything. Yeah, they do. This is one of the issues. There was a lot of this. You can find all kinds of historical stuff about the right to revolution, natural law, and all kinds of stuff. But after the Civil War, that ends that discussion. It ends the discussion about slavery and everything else. So sometimes wars do definitively end things. You can try to launch a revolution, but don't pretend that somehow the Constitution is going to support you or provide some kind of intellectual backing for it. That's not to say that the form of government can't be changed peacefully. But if you choose to violate the Constitution, then there's consequences to that, in my judgment, in my humble opinion.
So
A Second Amendment revolution to be legitimate within the Constitution is for the restoration of constitutional order and not its overthrow.
Well, okay, I don't think that's within the Constitution, but that would not be a constitutional act in that construct, I would suggest.
So we've mentioned, again, sort of Reconstruction and the need of the newly emancipated to defend themselves against violence, perhaps on the spectrum that Dave has mentioned. And I've written a piece on this and wanted to ask a question because I have an opportunity to sort of take the temperature of this panel on this issue. So the Black Panthers in the 1960s and some members of Black Lives Matter today have openly supported the idea of especially African-American men taking up arms to defend themselves from police violence, and some have actually resorted to violence. Are these Second Amendment anti-tyranny claims, or are these constitutional claims, in your opinion?
I will distinguish, go ahead.
Me?
Go for it, yes.
So I love this article by the Retail Rebellion, and I don't remember the rest of the title, but that's all you need to know. Look up Miller Retail Rebellion, you'll find it. I think it's a great piece. And somehow we talk about it every time we see each other too, right? So it categorizes resistance to government violence into three silos, which I think are a great framework. One is, at the one end, if you're attacked by, and it says, and I think everyone agrees, including Professor Miller, if you're attacked by a government agent improperly, you have a right to resist then and there. There was a video going around on Facebook maybe a year ago or so about a police officer who pulled a woman over and started raping her next to his patrol car, and it was all caught on the dash cam. I think everyone agrees that woman had a right to resist then and there, or someone had a right to help her. There was a case in Indiana where someone resisted illegitimate police violence. The Indiana Supreme Court said that, changed the common law of the state and said, no, you can never resist police violence. So in the first bill of the first session of the first bill in the next session of the Indiana legislature, that was immediately overturned within a couple of hours. Then at the other end, there's the situation of what happened in either Dallas or Houston a few years ago. I don't remember. I don't quite recall now. Someone was claiming some connection with Black Lives Matter, shot 5 police officers who were helping keep order at a parade or demonstration or something, saying that this was retribution for law enforcement violence against African Americans. And we agree, and I think most people do, that that's also completely illegitimate. And then there's this middle category where the question is, can someone be armed in case the government comes to attack? And the government can be police officers, it can be an army, it can be whoever, right? In case, and in fact, make it even broader, make it private individuals with or without government sanction. And I think that's where the disagreement is. I would say that the explicit goal of the Second Amendment was to allow the population to be armed exactly for that kind of confrontation, right? Exactly to be prepared in case some kind of government force, if we're going to speak about tyranny, comes to attack.
I mean, just a quick, oh, did you have?
Charlie, you?
Well, I think, yes, people have the right to defend themselves if they're unjustly attacked. But that's a criminal law concept. You don't draw that from the Second Amendment. We could have no Second Amendment, I believe, and you would still have the right to defend yourself under criminal law. That's different. And if we are saying that the Second Amendment is the linchpin for that, then we're asking for an arms race in this country because the police are going to keep getting heavier weapons. Why do you think police have assault weapons right now? Google the 1997 or 1995 bank robbery in LA when they were going up against guys who had automatic weapons. They had their little pistols. They had to break into a gun store to steal rifles. That led to this whole militarization. So now you have Ohio State University with armored vehicles because of football game problems. I mean, this is where we go with this. This is why I think we need to take a hard look at really, and not extrapolate the use of guns, that are essential to defending yourself. You can defend yourself, and you have to depend. We have to depend on the courts and lawful law enforcement to help defend us. But in last resort, of course, you can defend yourself, but that's not related to the Second Amendment, in my judgment. Not that we have any dispute here.
Two practical examples here. When Terry Sanford was governor of North Carolina in the early days of the civil rights movement, some civil rights activists wanted to have a big parade down a highway. And the governor says, well, I guess I can't technically stop you from doing that, but there's not going to be any police protection. And with the subtext that, yeah, and then the Klan and similar groups are out there, and so you're going to be attacked. And the protesters said, well, okay, Governor, but we are going to be armed if that's the situation. And then the governor changed his mind and provided police protection for the parade, and it went off peaceably. I would urge you all to learn about the Deacons for Defense and Justice, founded in the heart of Klan country in Louisiana, I believe in late 1964. They provided armed protection for civil rights workers in the rural South and sometimes in the towns pervasively, and were part of a general practice in the rural South of nonviolent, pacifist civil rights workers coming into the community and finding that the community was quite well armed and was absolutely insistent that it was going to protect them. And both that informal thing and the more organized groups like Deacons for Defense and Justice, which provided the armed protection for in the Meredith March for voting rights from Mississippi to Tennessee, protecting Dr. King himself as a personal bodyguard, they made a big difference. And their possession of arms, many of which they obtained, M1 rifles, carbines with 10 or 15 or 30 round magazines, and 38 special revolvers, were provided by the National Rifle Association in a program called the Civilian Marksmanship Program, where NRA gun clubs could buy federal military surplus at quite discounted prices. And so the NRA was the arsenal of the civil rights movement, and because it was that movement, there was a lot less violence against civil rights workers than there would have been otherwise, according to what the civil rights workers who were there and experienced it themselves say in their memoirs. Charles Cobb, C-O-B-B, is author of a great book on the subject called This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed, about his own experience and how, like so many of the Northerners who came south, they changed their mind on the gun issue and the pacifism issue in general because of their experience. Don Cates, who's the late Don Cates, one of the founders of the modern scholarly rediscovery of the Second Amendment, had exactly that experience. He came down from Yale to do voting rights in '65 and was surrounded by arms, which was quite protective of the people at the time.
Well, I can hardly keep my, I'm no pacifist, as
Yeah.
surprise, surprise.
Glad to hear that.
Secondly, I'm not against the Second Amendment, the Supreme Court's rule, I'm saluting smartly and marching on. But let's not pretend that people ought to be getting arms to protect themselves against rogue police forces or a rogue military or a rogue, even a rogue whatever band. If that's what you're going to depend on, you're in for some trouble, because guess what? An M1 and a 38 is not going to stop any serious group that's trying to oppress people. We have to depend on our collective wisdom and the collective wisdom of the people of the United States, who will insist on the protections that everybody has the right to observe. And I would also, I'm reminded of this discussion about when there was the march from Selma to Montgomery, and the Arkansas National Guard, or the Alabama National Guard commander said, "Oh, I can't defend Martin Luther King, there are too many people, blah, blah, blah." And Bobby Kennedy said, I'm going to hand the phone to the President of the United States, who's going to fire you. And then it's, oh, yeah, well, maybe I can get them together and defend this march. So I think we ought to have a little faith in our people, in our institutions. I know that's hard to do right now, but over time, and when you start really digging into them, it means something. And I think that this idea that people can gather in their basement with an antique rifle and resist, quote, tyranny, that's how people get killed in big numbers.
Charlie, that's a good segue to the next question, which I'm really curious as to how the panelists sort of, you might reject the premise, but so if in fact the anti-tyranny notion is either incipient or actual, with respect to the Second Amendment. What does that mean for firearm technology that has to be protected in private civilian hands? And how does one adjudicate that? Do you bring in military experts and ask, how to figure out what would effectively deter a despotic government, or how would you adjudicate those questions?
I would say, taking an idea that I got from a seminar in Montana that was held with the great William Van Alstyne, one of the absolute stars of constitutional law over the past half century, that the modern best interpretation of what arms are protected by the Second Amendment, or at least what are at the core, is the arms of an ordinary police officer. And I've represented police a great deal in Second Amendment litigation. The National Sheriff's Association, many other organizations, both in the Supreme Court and in Colorado. Peace officers are not the military. They are peacekeepers. They are a peace officer. They don't own guns to go on offense. The only reason a police officer has a gun is for lawful defense of self and others. So those are precisely the arms that the experts, who are correctly imitated by many American gun owners, what the police choose for the lawful defense of self and others, not SWAT teams, things like that, the ordinary police officer, are absolutely, in my view, at the core of what the Second Amendment right is. And no, it's not the same as what the Army has today with, nuclear weapons and, chemical weapons and that kind of stuff. But I think the record of history from the dawn of time up to the present shows that sometimes people who are resisting tyranny, even when sometimes underarmed and outnumbered, can succeed in some degree at the long run. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising started with 6 handguns, and not very good ones at that. And it took the Nazis longer to suppress the Warsaw Ghetto than it did for them to conquer the nation of France. So sometimes determined defenders can beat the odds and do well.
Well, doing well is not winning. I mean, that's not what we're about in this country, just to have a big heap of bodies. We're about preserving liberty. And if the idea that the level of tyranny that you're trying to resist is that which the, quote, ordinary police officer would have, that's a pretty low level. And believe me, that to me unravels the whole idea that the Second Amendment has something to do with resistance to tyranny. Because if that's all you're talking about, and oh, by the way, I'm from Philadelphia, and they have more than their little pistol in their police car, so.
No, they have an AR and they have high-quality shotgun.
I know, and so what are you talking about there? Because because believe me, if as heavier weapons, if they were available, and as they become more available, the police are going to arm up. So what is the ordinary policeman today is going to be the Terminator tomorrow. I mean, where do you draw the line with this?
George, you wanted to weigh in, I think.
Yeah, so I'm hearing 2 things from my learned colleague to my right.
Touche.
Yeah, there you go. One is an absolute faith that our government will protect us, even from itself. And by that I mean that all the internal nonviolent mechanisms that are built into our Constitution and our government, which are absolutely very good ones, will protect us. And 2, that an armed population couldn't possibly resist an armed government. And I think both of those notions are historically defective. If it's absolutely true that an armed population could never resist a vastly better armed government, we shouldn't be an independent nation. We should be British subjects. Vietnam would have turned out differently. Afghanistan, all of these places where our military had so much trouble. And I think historically, as Dave said, and the founders saw that, governments turn on their people. What's interesting to me is that when I teach my Second Amendment seminar in Southern Illinois, we have lots of military folks. The most vehement defenders of the anti-tyranny conception of the Second Amendment are the former military people, are all former military folks or current National Guard folks. And, you know, each year that I teach the course, there's a sort of different theme in the course. But this one comes up a lot, and the sense is, well, you know, would the military actually tyrannize the population, right? And what comes out of it is that, look, the military organizations are set up to follow orders. We don't know what information they have. They'll follow orders. And I think the 1957 Little Rock example with Central High School, if I remember the name correctly, is fascinating to me, right? So the governor of Arkansas had the National Guard blocking the school, preventing the 7 or 9 African-American students from going into the school, right? Sounds like a states' rights argument, right? I'm using my militia to prevent the federal government from coming to protect me. And the National Guard is following the governor's orders. So what does President Eisenhower do? He says, you now work for me. He federalizes the National Guard, sends it home, and it listens, right? It actually listened. Those National Guard troops went home, and then he sent in the troops, and the troops escorted the children into school. Who knows where those National Guardsmen's loyalties lied? I mean, I don't know. I think it lied with following orders. So I don't believe the notion that we can put complete and absolute trust in our government to be good to us, and I don't believe the notion that an armed population can't increase the costs and make things difficult enough for the government, perhaps until it gives up, until the military does change its mind and act differently, perhaps until outside help comes, and so on. Nothing's a guarantee, obviously, but I don't buy the notion that an armed population is as easily subdued as an unarmed one.
Just very quickly, happily, none of you have ever headed a genocidal regime or any other tyranny. But in terms of, you know, thinking about the hypotheticals and this and the army and that, all you can do is look at history and say every regime which has perpetrated genocide has attempted to first disarm the intended victims, and to the extent they have succeeded incompletely, as in Turkey against the Armenians, the armed resistance has saved many, many lives. And that is likewise true, as Aristotle said, tyrants always mistrust and disarm their people, and every tyranny considers disarmament an important thing to do. So when you look at it from the tyrant's perspective, there seem to be quite substantial risks and dangers of an armed population.
Okay.
Quick, Charlie, because I want to get to the audience.
Okay, 2 things. One is that whether a genocide happens or not is a way oversimplification to talk about whether or not the population is armed. And guess what? Armed populations conduct genocides. Take a look at Kosovo.
All right.
Secondly,
Sorry.
I can tell you about my
Thirdly, isn't it?
I can tell you about my intern who was a Bosniak who now lives in the United States, and he talked. The Bosnians were disarmed before they were mass murdered by the Serbian military, and the Dutch peacekeepers failed to provide the protection they had promised.
armed
So-
people didn't provide protection. Thank you.
So everybody has been holding their peace. I'm assuming that there is just a wellspring of questions to be asked by this lively panel. So who wants to ask one there?
Yeah, we talked about a lot about tyranny from the state. You mentioned in your opening remarks that it's also the Second Amendment would apply to much more of the individual side of the continuum, and I was wondering where you draw this inference from, and isn't that even more dangerous to society? Because if you assume that you can defend yourself against your boss with your weapon, what does that imply?
No, not all tyranny. This goes back to the best-selling book of the 1100s, Polycraticus, by John of Salisbury, who was the one who said, like a bishop could be a tyrant. As he explains, violent resistance, deadly force, is not appropriate against every kind of tyrant. Your bishop may be a complete jerk, but that doesn't mean you can kill him. So to clarify for that. And our laws for self-defense in this country and generally appropriately reflect that. There's, your third grade teacher can be a tyrant too, but you can't engage in armed resistance in that situation. You can engage in armed resistance against types of violent attacks.
So a couple of examples with, I'm suddenly quiet, a couple of examples of constitutional import in the U.S. The best one are, go from roughly the end of the Civil War through, the 1960s, where armed mobs would attack African Americans in the South, and nobody would do anything about it. The state police would not come to their aid. Sometimes it was the state militias doing the attacking. And in the debates over the 14th Amendment, that came up over and over again. We have to allow these individuals, we have to use the 14th Amendment to incorporate the second, they didn't use that word obviously, but right, to make the second applicable to the states because there were, these white mobs were terrorizing and killing, really, African Americans with impunity, and the black codes were preventing the African Americans from being armed. And the idea is that if they were armed, that would be a substantial deterrent against, home invasions that came out of nowhere by either anyone from the KKK to the state militias that, when they were off duty or something like that. An interesting example are like the gangs nowadays in bad parts of Chicago, someone raised earlier today. Is that one of constitutional import? I think so. I think you have a right to be in your home and not be attacked by, a gang that wants to shake you down or what have you.
And that's what Otis McDonald wanted.
That's true. There's a gentleman here in the Texas T-shirt. I want to hear from him.
Well, Professor Dunlap, you touched quickly on the idea of an arms race between the people and the police. Although, to me, it doesn't seem that there's much of an arms race because that would imply both parties building up arms, right? But it seems that the police are largely building up arms without really you seeing that on the side of the citizenry, right? Even in the bank robbery incident that you mentioned, those rifles as automatic weapons have been illegally converted to automatic weapons. So, I mean, is it really an arms race insofar as the police just seem to be building up arms and technology without any response really from the populace or justification?
Well, I think that in the age of terrorism and gang violence that we just heard about, that the police feel that they need this kind of heavy weaponry, but there was a study fairly recently that the militarization of police doesn't necessarily protect them and doesn't protect the population. So what you're raising, we do need to rethink that. I'm all in favor of protecting law enforcement personnel, and we do need appropriate weaponry and so forth, but that's not the same thing as saying that we want to put a gun in everybody's house because on the off chance that somebody's going to have a home break-in. Because I can tell you right now, from living decades in an environment where you have a lot of weapons, you're going to have accidents and people shooting each other that will be extremely egregious to our population. But let me make clear, I'm a supporter of the Second Amendment. It's in the Constitution, it's been interpreted. I don't agree with the interpretation, but it's there, so we have that. But let's not pretend that it's doing more work than it really does. That's my point.
I have no idea where that cell phone is.
It's not mine. Mine doesn't even work like that. You'd be here in Big Ben if it was mine.
Just to be thorough, I'm going to check mine. No, it's not me either.
Somebody's dial-in. This is not a dial-in show. Yes. John McCare.
In the Trayvon Martin case, which side exhibited tyranny?
So Trayvon Martin being the person, African-American male, killed in Florida by George Zimmerman, who had a personal sidearm and had taken on the role of defending the neighborhood.
That's the kind of question that is appropriately answered by juries based on the facts of the case.
I agree. I don't think tyranny is, we don't want to transform every criminal act into this larger discussion of tyranny.
Oh, but I take the founder's view that it's all a continuum. If somebody who's attacks you and is pounding your head into the sidewalk to try and kill you, whether that person's an individual or part of some gang or is part of a criminal government, is fundamentally the same thing. And your right to resist all of them is fundamental and inherent and recognized but not granted by the Second Amendment.
It's a fascinatingly complex case. I was asked to write a short piece, a book review online, and I found myself looking up all these details on that case and what we actually know about it. I listened to the calls, and so I write this piece, and the editor says, well, there's too much detail here. There's too much information. The words were roughly, this is journalism, this isn't court, something like that. So it's just extraordinarily complicated. What happened? Who knows? It's stunningly complicated.
The gentleman here. I want to get to the gentleman
That's
here.
a little bit of a facile oversimplification as well.
Let's get this guy here.
So if tyranny includes all these things that you said it does, then tyranny also includes someone with a gun shooting people in the school, in a movie theater, et cetera.
Absolutely.
And the way that you've sort of described, like, cherry-pick these examples of, like, minorities needing guns to protect themselves against armed mobs because they had guns in the first place, et cetera, like, sort of ignores, it isn't, you're not comparing it to all the people who are killed because of the tyranny of allowing people to have guns in the first place, right? So each of these examples of someone like, if they had a gun or they did have a gun, stopping a killing, like, can you explain to me, like, how that matches up or weighs against all the time someone is killed because someone has a gun in the first place?
Go ahead.
I think you're saying that we have to do a thorough cost-benefit, in effect, right, to use economic terms in any situation. How much harm do guns cause versus how much benefit do they provide? I think you're exactly right. I think one thing that's wrong with this debate, with this public debate, this public conversation, is that all we ever do is hear one side of it at one time. Someone shoots 50 people out of a Las Vegas hotel, which was another bizarre situation, and anyway, I won't go there. I'm not much of a conspiracy theorist, but that's one where the conspiracy theory side of me kicks into gear. And that's all we have. And look, what can we do? We have to stop this. And then the other side, you hear just recently, the CDC ran some studies that it suppressed that there are over 2 million defensive gun uses per year. Somehow, if we're having a policy conversation at least, which I think is where you're going. Ultimately, I think you're asking a policy question. We have to look at both of these, and nobody really does that properly. And so I think your point is absolutely right. We do need to look at all of these, right, the costs and the benefits. Unfortunately, social science is really, really hard to do. And the reason for that is that we can't compare our reality to a counterfactual reality where there are no guns and no bad people, there never were guns, and so on. The only place where we can really get even remotely close to comparing counterfactual realities to each other is in the clinical context, where we have double-blind studies and so on, like in the pharmaceutical testing context. Otherwise, there's an extraordinary amount of guesswork that goes into it. But fundamentally, your point is a right one. We need to consider all of these things, right? Both sides of this question.
Wait. Charlie, did you want to say anything?
I was just going to say, we know that most of the gun deaths are suicides. And so my view now, given the Supreme Court's opinion, is that I think the Heller opinion is very problematic, because if it is about personal defense, and right now it's limited to the home, I think we're starting to see cases that, hey, if it really is, then why not open carry everything else? I think the Supreme Court is going to have to come back and revisit it, or we're going to have lower courts that really look at what the court said and these constraints that aren't really logical, but nevertheless in there, because, it takes a long time before somebody gets competent to use a weapon in a defensive situation. Because if you think, I've gone to the gun range twice and took a 2-hour course, when somebody is pointing a gun at you, there's going to be all kinds of things going through your head that aren't going to be, you don't know who you're going to hit.
Professor Christie, really quickly.
So that idea is suspect in my mind.
Be terse.
Just of this problem which you're talking about is the problem of the common law, which permits you, if in order to preserve your own life, you can take the life of another person. But Under the English rule, and that's the problem with the Trayvon Martin business, you have to retreat to the wall. You just can't shoot the guy just because he might kill you. In the Florida is where there's no retreat law, and there are many states in this country which do not require any kind of retreat. And in the Trayvon Martin Zimmerman situation, Zimmerman claimed that he thought the guy had a gun, and the jury believed that, you know, where he had some kind of a knife or something like that. And that to me is extremely dangerous, because you can always come up with an argument that, well, it's also like the sexual thing, whether it's agreed or not agreed or what have you. Well, I thought she was thinking, and what.
That's drifting a little far.
Well, basic issue.
right.
What's going on?
So,
I could get a,
What
Sure,
a person
sure.
could seriously believe is
A
the
really-
world.
a really quick response. I think that the observation is about the common law and the second.
integrate that with a previous question. Yes, of course, a school shooter, for example, like other criminals, is a tyrant, and they're particularly, in their behavior, quite interested in the tyrannical, their lust for tyranny is something they plan to exercise for months. The U.S. Constitution is an anti-tyranny document in its division of powers and many other ways, but it was also something that said, well, preventing tyranny isn't just constraining the government. You also need to have an effective government that, you know, that can raise an army to defend the nation, and that can call forth the militia and do everything else, and have a unified trade system, which will make our country stronger. And likewise, steps against people who misuse guns are also part of the anti-tyranny purpose of our Constitution and are compliant with the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment does make the ultimate empirical decision that never will decent people be left defenseless and unable to have the essential tools for the protection of themselves against micro-tyrants or tyrannical government.
All right, I'm going to take moderator's privilege really quick. This is like the lightning round. Lots of states have experimented with amending their own state constitutional right to keep and bear arms. They're not exactly the same as the federal Second Amendment. If you could take your pen and redraft the federal Second Amendment, how would you do so? Charlie.
I would redraft it to make it very explicit it's related to the militia to wit the National Guard. And if they want to work in something about the unorganized militia of the United States, does everybody know they're part of or males, anybody? Okay, but it should be in that context and allow the federalism to provide the offset.
All right, George.
I'll say something similar. Except the opposite, that, you know, it should, same idea. It should be made clear to talk about self-defense and so on. I shouldn't have to be writing an article that talks about what each side has to explain away, right? I should be able to write an article that says the Second Amendment says this, here's why. I shouldn't have to make an argument based on this side has a harder time explaining away what the amendment says than the other side. That it's
good. Dave.
Ever since the first right to arms provision was put in Anglo-American law, the 1606 Virginia Charter, people have been upgrading and improving it. The Second Amendment was a step in that process. Colorado's 1876 Constitution had the strongest right to arms protection ever written in the English language, and now other states have exceeded that. Idaho, Missouri, and Louisiana are some, Oklahoma, Kansas are some states that have recently enacted more modern, more comprehensive, and more wordy ways to say things. So any of those would be fine, but I think the Second Amendment was quite good for, in its terseness among other things, because it perfectly captures the fact that the right to arms is an individual right and a collective right. Those are not opposites. Those are two complementary aspects of it. Resistance to tyranny of the home invader is something to be done individually. The right to arms is individual, but at times protecting your community from other kinds of tyranny, whether those are rioters or invaders or anything else is something that necessarily must often be done collectively. And the Second Amendment has them both in just a few words.
And
So
with
it's
that-
quite impressive.
My
Thank you.
advice,
Sorry,
don't try
Charlie.
that at home.
We're out of time, Charlie. Thank you very much.
Do you want to come out and talk to one of